Good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining me. My name is Josh Long. I'm the developer advocate for the open source Spring technologies at Pivotal. And as you can see on the screen, that's my Twitter handles. If you have questions or comments, email, Twitter, find me online. I'm happy to answer questions. I want to, and I cannot put too fine a head on this, I want to thank Rob Winch. Rob is the lead of both Spring Session and Spring Security, which whose use cases drove Spring Session. Thank you, Rob, for all the help with the code. Thank you for all the help with the project itself and with the narrative for this talk. Literally couldn't have and wouldn't have wanted to do it without you. Thank you so much. So that's Rob Winch, Twitter and so on. He's one of those people where if you see him, just buy him a beer. He deserves it for something. You don't even have to know what. Just remember, beer. The guy's amazing. Okay, so about me, I'm the author of going on 5 books now on Spring and Spring-centric technologies, 3 different video series for live lessons, Pearson. And my new work, the new things I'm working on these days, all tend to focus on cloud native applications. They all focus on building applications that work well with on a cloud platform, microservices, otherwise known as cloud native applications. And that's actually the sort of focus of what a lot of us, in fact, all of us are doing at Pivotal. And that's why this particular talk on Spring Session is interesting to me. Because again, our focus is at Pivotal. It's about building applications that work well in the cloud. We have a cloud called Cloud Foundry. It's an open source platform as a service. And while there are many others like it, obviously we hope you'll use that one. And Cloud Foundry is a platform. Think of it as a place to run applications. And so what we spend a lot of time talking to developers about is how do I build the best darn application I can to run on that cloud? And, surprise, surprise, the architecture that runs the best on a cloud like Cloud Foundry or Heroku or Google App Engine, etc., looks nothing like the application that ran, the best it could on WebSphere 10 years ago. And so it's been sort of a challenge to kind of get people thinking about this new architecture. And once they get the hang of it, it's really easy. But then we invariably, intellectually, and I'm sure my friend Peter, who's also on the line, can attest to this. Invariably, we get the discussion about how do we forklift existing applications, existing Spring applications, of which, by definition, given a 12-year-old project, there are many. How do we forklift existing applications into this new place, this new platform, this new environment, the wild west of the cloud? And Cloud Foundry is particularly forgiving, but there are some issues. And one of the issues that people face a lot is how do I manage my HTTP session? So in this talk, we're going to talk about the HTTP session. We're going to talk about the way you use it from inside of a servlet container. There are different types of use cases, but historically, the HTTP session has not been our friend. In fact, I'd argue that it's been rife with abuse. It's been a dumping ground for really, 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 really poor excuses for technology that use it to store state that really, nowadays there's no reason that state should be on the server at all in the first place a lot of times. And if it still needs to be there, then it should be done in a way that's fairly disciplined. Otherwise you end up with this oddity, right, where you're trying to optimize an application even given the excess burden. So the HTTP session has become sort of the redheaded stepchild. It's been something that we've discouraged, but there are still some use cases, right? Some use cases that are very, very valuable, particularly today. One of them is security. People say, well, you should move to a stateless architecture. Everything should be stateless. And of course, that's nonsense, right? I mean, even TCP at the lowest level has state. Some things require state. The question is, where do you keep that state? For the cloud, the consensus, the wisdom has always been, keep it in a backing service. Don't keep it in RAM buffers, co-located with your application. Usually that means don't keep it in the session. But even there are some places where the HTTP session can be quite valuable. For example, authentication tokens. If you need a self-expiring, ephemeral state for application state, not business logic state, but actual sort of incidental state that you need in the sort of maintenance of your application and the upkeep of your application, then that is a great place for it. The HTTP session is made for that. So you need some state. Sometimes the session is the right place to put it, and it's pretty darn easy to get started with. Anybody who's ever built a session-based application knows the allure. They know the charms of the HTTP session. It's just so easy, particularly in the default case. You take a regular Tomcat, for example. Obviously, this is an old slide, old release rather. Tomcat is now at version 8, so Tomcat 6 is the page you're going to find when you look for this information. You take an existing Tomcat, deploy your Spring-based application, and start chucking things into the session, and you'll end up with Java objects being stored in what is basically a glorified hash map that survives the request-response cycle. And the session information is very forgiving, actually, because it's just RAM in your local machine. It's just fine, even if you don't comply with the servlet spec, even if you don't keep things serializable, you'll still get stuff that works. In the more complex production-centric case, you're going to get into trouble. You're going to have different types of replication scenarios. For example, you might want to have different instances that are stood up that replicate state across the cluster. And this is where things get a little bit more painful. Here's the configuration on my screen here for setting up session replication and clustering in Tomcat as of version 6. Again, it's not that the configuration is in of itself all that scary. I mean, it really isn't. If you do it, you'll see it actually works out pretty nicely. It does the job. However, this is not something that you as a developer are going to care about, and that means you don't get to optimize it. You don't get to have input into what's happening here. It's going to be something that's going to be managed by the container, and thus more than likely the operations team. This goes against several things. It flies in the face of the trend towards infrastructure as code, DevOps, etc. It's one more moving part that you have to now manage and get right for your application. And even if you're using Jetty, of course, it doesn't matter which. I use Tomcat here, but it doesn't matter which one you're using: WebSphere, JBoss, Jetty, Tomcat, etc. It's this extra thing that you have to now know about when you deploy your application, and it's the extra thing that you have to get right. More to the point, even if you do get it right, what's to say that they got it right? Session replication, or put another way, state replication across nodes, is a hard problem. If it weren't, then there wouldn't be such an incredible demand for things like Cassandra, for Memcache, for Redis, etc. And so while I have a lot of confidence in the committers behind Apache Tomcat, I have a lot of confidence in the committers behind Jetty, I would argue that this is probably not the thing that they wake up, eager to try and solve. It's something that you might want to let a more appropriate store, but not, by the way, a database, not a SQL database like this Jetty example, do. So you might think, okay, well, sure, it's not the greatest and it's not super simple to set up, but surely that's it, right? I'm done. Well, yeah, I mean, I guess that's enough if you're running locally, if you're running in a standalone, bare metal scenario. What about when you move to the cloud? Well, again, moving to the cloud it's not such a great win. And this is not, I started with Heroku, but again, this is not a Heroku specific story. Or problem, rather. It's pretty much all platforms as a service suffer from the following limitations. First of all, in clouds in general, not just platforms as a service, multicast is a huge no-no. It's something that's very hard to get right in network topographies, right? Especially ephemeral network topologies. So relying on that is not advisable, right? You have restrictions there in the kinds of networking you can do. Even if you were permitted to do it, this is not something that the sort of opinionated environments endorse, and there's a lot of good reasons. First of all, availability of resources. So most platforms as a service environments have a smallish, compared to your classic heavy WebSphere deployments, a smallish amount of RAM allocated to each Java process. On Heroku, I think it's like 512 megs of RAM. So again, even if you do use that for session state, you don't have a lot to play with. It's just not the right place. You can scale out better by using something larger. And getting that story right on certain environments is, if not hard, impossible. Heroku, for example, doesn't support session replication or session affinity. These are two different features. Session replication refers, of course, to the replication of state from one node to another. This is, of course, a desirable feature when you go to production and you start moving beyond the single node scenario. The idea is I might have a user, and the user's actively engaged in the website, perhaps making purchases and adding things to the shopping cart, and then blam, something goes wrong and the node goes down. What happens? Does the state get replicated to another node? One would hope, right? That's what the session replication story is all about. But of course, that doesn't happen for you in most platforms as a service, for example, in Heroku. The next thing you need is, of course, if you know that you have an application that's going to be in front of a load balancer, a router, and that load balancer is going to round robin dispatch your connections to different instances, you would hope that the router is at least smart enough to do session affinity or sticky sessions. That is to say, if the request goes into the router and it hits a node and that node creates a session cookie, hopefully, in the interest of economy of resources, all subsequent resources, or requests rather, are going to be also forwarded to that single instance. It'll be pinned to that instance. If that single pinned instance goes down, hopefully session replication is in place and the state is available on another node. But again, these are our big hopefuls, and in a lot of environments, for very good reasons, it's just not possible, right? So Heroku doesn't support either one. Cloud Foundry, for the longest time, only supported sticky sessions. That is to say, you could make a request, have the request serviced by a single pinned instance, and then all subsequent requests, when presented with that cookie, would go to the right instance. This was a sort of convenience feature to forklift existing applications into this environment. But again, it wasn't really what people were looking for in production because it didn't support session replication. So again, you're not in a production environment. You can't really rely on an app that's session intensive if you don't have the ability to guarantee that session state is not going to be dropped on the floor whenever that instance goes down, as tends to happen in a dynamic cloud environment. So in 2014, we announced a story for session replication, assuming you're using the Java build pack on Cloud Foundry. And of course, build packs are a cross-platform, cross-cloud thing. They work on Cloud Foundry and Heroku. So you could, of course, use our build pack on Heroku. In theory, I haven't tried it out. But we announced a update to the build pack that caters specifically to the use case of I've got an existing .war-based application that I want to deploy to Tomcat, not Jetty, not the Undertow web container that ships with Wildfly, not any other container, just Apache Tomcat, standalone, not embedded. If I want to deploy an application like that, then as long as I create a backing service, and when we talk about the cloud and we talk about backing services, we're talking about services that are exposed over the network and whose locator and credential information is provided by environment variables to the application. So a Redis connection or a SQL database connection might be exposed as a backing service and consumed by the application that dereferences it from the environment, uses it to create a connection or a data source or what have you, and then connects. So if you have a backing service that points to a Redis database and it's named, or it has a substring of its name, session-replication, then that service will automatically be plugged into the automatically stood up Tomcat, and it'll be plugged into the Tomcat session replication strategy. So that's a convenience. That's a very, very nice feature. But again, you're sort of relying on a feature that's very, very specific here. You're relying on Redis in this case, which is a great choice, absolutely. But you might want to use something else. And so for all these different reasons, one is the arcana of having to set the stuff up inside of your container, the friction you're going to experience when you move to a cloud environment, the problems of trying to get this to work across containers, all all of these reasons and more, we created the Spring Session project. And the Spring Session project is, it's a wrapper around the HTTP session object that comes in the Servlet API. The Servlet API actually provides for this approach. It provides for this technique. It's something that you're supposed to be able to do. And this is a very novel, very nice way to do it. What it means is that your application code can now be the governor of this kind of configuration. Even better, your application can move from one container to another, be it embedded or deployed into a standalone application server or a more lightweight web container. Whatever your preference, you can now make that decision once and then just not worry about it. And you can get it right because you can configure everything just as you would your data source and so on. So again, the services you care about are managed with your application. Here we have a web.xml equivalent. This is a Servlet 3 feature. It's the equivalent of web.xml. It's a programmatic way to install servlets, filters, listeners, etc. And Spring Session provides the abstract HTTP session application initializer. Kind of a mouthful. Behind the scenes, this initializer is going to find a strategy for storing state, be it a map-based or Redis-based, and it'll use that to actually proxy all requests to the Servlet API to this backing store. It's worth mentioning that Spring Session is not tied to Spring. I don't consider that a particular feature, but it is worth noting. What this means is that if you have an existing app that doesn't, for ghastly, unknowable reasons, that does not use Spring, you can still get this mechanism. You can still install this mechanism. And of course, it will bring in Spring, but your app doesn't need to be using Spring otherwise. So you can get session replication, just like you can get Spring security in any environment. As a case in point, there's a sample that the amazing Mr. Winch has included in the Spring Session repository that basically demonstrates straight servlets. So here's a straight regular Servlet 3.0 or later HTTP servlet that takes two parameters, an attribute name and an attribute value, and then uses those to set an attribute key on the HTTP session and then renders a page. As you refresh, you'll see that the value that's been inserted persists, and then if you inspect your Redis instance or your backing store, you'll see that those values are still there, and they're in the backing store. So that's very convenient, right? It works in different environments. Works in doesn't matter what your technology stack. Works in the cloud. It's polyglot. I mentioned that it supports maps. This is actually a very, very useful feature in of itself. The map use case, the Java util.map use case, is that you can give Spring Session a reference to a map, and it'll store keys and values in that map. Remember that all your favorite distributed data grids also export their interface as a map if you ask them nicely. So Hazelcast, Gemfire, Coherence, Memcached, Redis, or via Spring Data Redis, all provide ways to get access to a Java util.map implementation that is backed by these data grids. So you can provide these live data grid aware map references to Spring Session, and voila, you're off to the races. We have specific support for Redis, and we use Listener. We use Redis's feature ability to create notifications about certain things, so we can handle, for example, expiry, session expiry. We use all those features in Redis to build a slightly more sophisticated integration. But again, there's no reason you couldn't get a long way just using the map implementation. And of course, because it is a strategy, you can plug your own in. So let's look at a very, very simple, basic Spring Session-based application using Spring Boot. All of these examples are on my GitHub on github.com/JOSHLONG/bootiful-sessions. So BOOTIFUL-sessions. We're going to look at a very simple example first. So here's our code. By the by, all of these examples are I drew these from Rob's amazing efforts. I've converted everything to Spring Boot because, well, first of all, I'm lazy, and second of all, I hope you guys are too, and third of all, less code, so easier to understand and easier to kind of reason about. So you can get the Spring Boot versions of this code in my repository. I expect a lot of them will, a lot of the changes, if there are any, will eventually be visible back there. Either way, you'll get what you need. So don't, feel no hesitation in checking out either one. So okay, this is a very simple Spring Boot application. You can tell because it says Spring Boot application. We've got the @enable Redis HTTP session annotation. This is a Spring session annotation that turns on the mechanism that we want. And then this class is actually also a REST controller, just for conciseness. There's no reason, technically that they have to be in the same thing. There's a method here called hello. It's a controller method. It's a Spring MVC controller. And it says, given a request to / provide the active HTTP session, give me a UUID, and then if the UUID is null, create it, and then store it in the session, and then return the page. So this is very similar to the hello session example that I showed on the slides, except that we're using Spring here. The important thing to understand is that the @enable Redis HTTP session annotation brings in the Redis HTTP session configuration from Spring session, and it sets up, among other things, a Redis message listener container, which, as I described earlier, is used to handle notifications about the expiry of certain things and deletion of certain events. It provides a Redis template that Spring Session uses to talk via Spring Data Redis to our backing Redis instance. And beyond that, it also plugs in the current active HTTP session strategy. So again, you'll get a default if you don't provide one, but if you do provide one, then this will be injected and it'll be considered otherwise. See, so there you go. Okay, so let's go ahead and see this all up and running. Run. While that's going, we'll take a look at the build here. Again, the build is fairly unassuming. Most of these examples are going to be based in Spring Boot, so we're going to have Spring Boot Starter Redis. Spring Boot Starter Redis is going to start up it's going to provide a default Redis connection factory that'll point to the local host Redis connection factory for us. It's just convenient. It'll automatically configure that bean, but we could just as easily have created a bean of this form, Redis connection factory, right, like so, my special Redis, whatever. And that would be considered instead, right? It's by type, so it doesn't matter. The Redis that gets created is going to be used by Spring Session. We're going to set up a web service. So we've used Spring Boot Starter Web, and of course the unit testing support is there. This is Spring Session itself. It's very, to get everything you need, you just need this one dependency for Redis. It's already GA, so it's 1.0 release. You can go ahead and ship the bits in production. There's a lot of great stuff there already. And okay, I guess it's up and running. We should check it out. Let's see. Localhost. There we are. So I've made a request. I'm going to go ahead and actually backtrack here. What I'll do is I'm going to go to my console, and we're going to confirm upon logging into Redis CLI that we've got one session in there, right? So here's our one session, and here's the key space. Here's the key for the expirations for the session, and we're going to do flush all. I'll do keys again. You'll see that there's nothing in there now. So if I refresh this page, remember this is printing a cache to UUID. But of course, I've just deleted everything in the cache. So CE24, C226, etc. should no longer be there. It'll be a new value. There you go. So it's now, if I refresh it as many times as I want, I have the same cached instance. If I go here again, delete everything, and now refresh, C206 F5 should be different, and there you go. So you can see that there's a direct correlation between what's in that database and what we see on the screen here. Okay. Close this. Now, we mentioned the HTTP session strategy. This is one of the nice side effects of using a framework like Spring Session is that you can now plug things in that you couldn't otherwise easily exert control over. For example, if you want to continue to use cookies, a la the JSession ID from servlet infamy, you can, no problem at all. In this case, the cookie it has a pluggable name, however, so you can give it a different name. You might have my custom cookie as a cookie name or whatever. That's pluggable. And now you can also use headers. And this is a strategy. So if you can think of some other way to communicate, you can. What you're doing is you're correlating the block of memory in the server, in this case in Redis, to the HTTP client that's making the request. However you want to do that, you can plug that in. So of course, cookies are a natural thing to use in an HTML web application because JavaScript supports it and so on. But headers, if you're just, that can be very useful in of itself as well. In fact, you can get a sort of poor man's OAuth, if you will, a poor man's security. So in this example, we're going to look at using the header-based HTTP session strategy. And we're going to use it to create a token, and then that token will be used in substitution for a username and password. So what we have here is a Spring Boot application. Same as before, Spring Boot starter Redis, Spring Session data Redis, Spring Boot starter security. So this is a secured web application. And also worth noting, I'm using Spring Security 4.0 CI snapshot. This is a new release. That stuff will be GA pretty soon, but because of some of the stuff I'm doing, I wanted to take advantage of some of those features. So this is using that instead. So otherwise, very identical to what we had before. If we run the application, get it started, you'll see that we have we've plugged in the header HTTP session strategy here. We've got a REST controller endpoint that'll listen on / and return a map, which gets converted eventually to a JSON structure with an attribute called username, and the username is the authenticated principal that's been making the request. So again, the idea is that you're going to be able to authenticate using HTTP basic, and of course we've got one user and one password of user ID user and password, and that HTTP basic authentication will authenticate the client, and then of course this request will end up with that JSON structure with the authenticated principal's username. Let's go ahead and run it now. So we're going to use curl just to keep things simple. So curl is a command line utility that you can use as an HTTP client. I'm going to say make an HTTP request to localhost :8080 / and then send the user and password, user : password, and then be verbose about it. So print out everything, including the headers that you send back. When we make the request, we see, of course, in our output, the username, just as we expected. This is, we knew that was coming. More importantly, we see the header XAuth token that is sent back from the server. And this is what what we, as a client, are expected to transmit on all subsequent requests. Just like with a cookie, if you send back, if you make a request to a session-based application that uses a cookie, it'll send you back a cookie header, basically, and then you're supposed to transmit that cookie in all your subsequent requests to keep this idea of a contiguous session, a conversational, to keep this idea of conversational state alive. So we're going to go ahead and now make another request, but instead of sending our username and password, we'll just use the XAuth token value that comes back. So what I'm saying here is make the HTTP request again, send the header called XAuth token, and send the value that we've got here, hit go, and we get back the same thing as we had before. To show that this is actually doing what we think, I'm going to go ahead and tamper with the token a little bit, and you'll see that I'm now challenged. I need full authentication. My access is not permitted. So the application is secure, and it only works with that XAuth token. Do I recommend that you do this? No. Use Spring Security OAuth. You can get something it's a few more lines of code, and you can get it up and running pretty quickly, and you'll have an access token, and it's actually meant to handle this use case if you're using the implicit auth flow. But if you don't have the time and you really want something, this should demonstrate that it's pretty easy to get up and running. XAuth token, by the by, whenever you see a header in HTTP that's preceded with X-, that indicates that this is a custom header. This is not something standard. It's just API specific or app specific token, or header rather. Indulgences, please, folks. Sorry. This is a custom header, and it means that you can change it. So you can actually parameterize the header HTTP session strategy by providing in your own custom header name. But otherwise, you'll just get X off token. That's what's happening here by default. Okay. Before I forget, each of these examples has a manifest.yaml. These are Cloud Foundry manifests. They basically they articulate to a cloud like Cloud Foundry what is required to manage and run this application. In this case, I am telling Cloud Foundry that this application requires a backing service that has to have the name ll-redis-session. It can be my-redis session or whatever. The point is you're supposed to create a backing service and give it this name, and then thanks to the way that Spring Boot works, it'll automatically, and if you have the Spring Cloud connectors, it'll automatically substitute the Redis connection factory that Spring Boot is automatically creating for you with the connection that is managed and exposed via the cloud. So the same application will work on localhost as well as in the cloud with no changes, just CF push. This is a side effect of this architecture, but it's certainly interesting.
Josh, can I pause you there for a second? Because I think a lot of people don't understand what Boot can do for them on Cloud Foundry in that regard. Would it derail you too much to kind of explain that basic mechanism for 30 more seconds?
Sure. So Cloud Foundry knows about Spring applications thanks to the build pack. This feature I just described is not specific to Tomcat-based apps or anything. It knows about jars. It knows about any container. It doesn't care about that. What it'll do is it'll look in your application context, find beans of a well-known type, for example, javax.sql.data source, and if it finds an equivalent service bound to your application, it'll map the bean that you've got in your local application to the backing service that you've got exposed in your cloud environment. So if I have a MySQL or a Postgres that I've exposed using Elephant SQL, for example, which is a platform as a service service provider, that information is available in the environment, and Spring can pick that up and automatically substitute the javax.sql.data source that you've got in your application that may, for example, just be H2. It might be embedded, it might be in memory, or it might just be pointing to a MySQL instance on localhost. It doesn't matter. If you've only got one backing service and you've got one javax.sql.data source in your configuration, it'll act as though that original bean doesn't exist, and it'll create it'll replace it with the correct credentials for that cloud managed backing service. The same is true for Redis. The same is true for MongoDB. The same is true for numerous different services, all thanks to the Spring Cloud PaaS connectors. So again, this is a mechanism you can plug in. You can, for example, I think get SendGrid. I think there's actually a PaaS connector for SendGrid. So if you have a Java mail session, it'll just do the right thing and wire in your SendGrid credentials as well, and so on, or wire in the SendGrid Java mail client and so on. So it's just a generic extension, a generic mechanism that works in Spring Boot. It works in Spring. It's using the Spring Cloud connectors, or you can use the build pack. The build pack is Cloud Foundry and Heroku specific. If you use the PaaS connectors, you get the equivalent functionality, but that isn't relying on the build pack. It's actually in the code itself, and that also works for Heroku and Cloud Foundry. So, okay.
Thank you very much, Josh. Really appreciate that.
My pleasure. Okay, and let's see, where are we? Demonstration, session strategies, voila. So, next use case. So, thus far, we've seen how easy it is to get an existing web application up and running and using Spring Session. It works in all manner of environments, all manner of containers. And I would argue it's markedly simpler than the alternative to get, production grade session replication. Remember, all this time I've been using Redis, and the reason our default implementation is using Redis is because Redis is boss sauce awesome software. It really, really scales. You don't have to take my word for it. Just ask Twitter, who use it to cache all the tweets. So that's the kind of scale it's meant for. It's meant for lots and lots of data, particularly algorithmic data. So keys and values, sets, atomic integers. If you need to do bit shifting in a distributed way. That there's support for that kind of stuff as well. So it's a very, 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 very powerful way to store this exact kind of data, key value data, session data. A lot of people use Memcache. That's the same idea, and of course Redis speaks the same protocol. So if you already use Memcache, you can front your service with a Memcache client and talk to Redis instead. So that's all just a matter of achieving parity. Although I would argue that you've got a better story now because it's faster and it's meant to work. I think I reminded you that you have to do the right thing here. You can't just rely on some very forgiving application servers that let you write into the session and use non-serializable objects. You may get away with that in some containers, but that's only because the objects are in memory in a single node on the same process. As soon as you have to start putting data into a distributed store, or as soon as you have to start serializing it, when you move to the session replication state, session replication case, even in basic Tomcat or Jetty or whatever, you have to make sure all your entities that are persisted are serializable in the Java language sense of the word. And that is definitely true here, right? Because you're writing to Redis. Redis is cross-platform. You can talk to Redis from other languages, be it C or Python or Ruby on Rails or whatever. But Java lang serialization is not. So for the moment, there's no way to share the session information in a useful way from other languages. That was a question I got when we did the first one in this webinar for EMEA a couple hours ago. That is coming. Still stay tuned. Though we'll look at a way that is possibly addressed by a further subsequent update. So anyway, parity achieved. Let's look at some of the use cases where Spring Session adds value above and beyond what you have otherwise. One particular use case, and in fact the one that motivated Rob down the rabbit hole of creating the Spring Session project, was WebSockets. As you know, or hopefully you know, Spring supports two different stories for WebSockets. Of course, we support the standard in the few places where you can get a servlet implementation that supports it. That is a very new specification. There are not very many production environments that support it. I think Tomcat is the only one that I know of. There's probably a couple others, but you'd be surprised who doesn't support it in production yet. So that's important. We also support we support compatibility with the NIO-based container-specific engines as well. So if you're using Apache Tomcat 6, you can still use WebSockets using the Spring abstraction, even if you don't have the latest and greatest bits. And that's for the better, because the Spring WebSocket support is, I think, a little bit more well thought out. And one of the corner cases that the standards fails to address has to do with WebSockets and HTTP sessions. So the way it works is that if you log into an application and you establish an HTTP session, and then you start making WebSocket communication, you start doing WebSocket communication back and forth between the client and the server, that session will eventually time out. There's no correlation. Nothing is happening to perpetuate that HTTP session. Unless you make an HTTP request, that HTTP session doesn't know about anything you're doing over WebSockets. However, the WebSocket connection is dependent on the HTTP session. So if the HTTP session dies, so too does the WebSocket session. So it becomes very useful to have a way to perpetuate or extend the HTTP session. And there's no support for that in the standard, which is to say, not a great experience for developers. There are some that have argued that, oh yeah, sure, we might want that behavior, and that's fine. I agree that might be a use case you want. You want that to expire, but perhaps there could have been some consideration for the alternative use case, which in my perspective is far more ubiquitous, far more useful. So anyway, use the Spring WebSocket support if you can. And one of the benefits of using that along with Spring Session is that we automatically perpetuate the HTTP session for you using Spring Session. So we'll go ahead and take a look at an example here. I don't have the time, unfortunately, on this webinar to sit here and wait for an HTTP session to expire just to prove a point. But I invite you to take a look at the code. It's public static void main, so you can just open it up in any IDE in the last 5 years, 10 years that supports Maven, and then hit run, and it'll start up. And what we've got going on here is a standard WebSocket application. It's using Spring Security. It's a chat-based application. You log in, you set up a user detail service, you do bcrypt. You tell Spring Security to use bcrypt encoded passwords, and then using some of the features in Spring Security 4. This is one of the drivers again for Spring Session. We've also got WebSocket security, right? So that's the important piece here, and you can see that down here. You could do a whole webinar entirely on this stuff, just what's happening here. But I'll leave that for Rob. The important piece for us is that we have a WebSocket config whereupon we extend the abstract session WebSocket message broker configurator. Kind of a mouthful. And that in turn brings in the session repository message interceptor. And then that is over here. And then what this bean does is it implements message interceptor and channel interceptor. Where's my object here? Here we are. Channel interceptor and handshake interceptor, I'm sorry. So these are two different lifecycle callbacks that you can get in the WebSocket abstraction that tell you when a message has been sent and when a connection has been established. That is to say, when a handshake has occurred between the client and the service. The WebSocket protocol is actually two different protocols. One is the convention between the client and server to establish the connection, called the handshake, and then the promotion into WebSockets from HTTP, and that is based on a separate protocol, and that's actually separate input, output, separate port, all that stuff. So both of these events are interesting, and you want to know about both. And what we do is with Spring Session, it just inserts itself in those lifecycle events, and basically perpetuates the session, just updates it. So this is the important line right there: update the last access time by simply saving the session in our repository here. So this is very, very convenient. It's not all that much code, thankfully, because it's a very pluggable framework. It gets the job done, but it is nice to have around. So let's go ahead and look at the application now. I'm going to log in. Remember, I'm using the data in data.sql. I've got 3 different users here: Rob, Luke, and myself. The password is password, but it's bcrypt encrypted. So we'll enter our password. I'm going to log in as myself here. Password. Not now, 1Password. Okay, logged in as me. Here's another one. And I'm going to choose, I'm logged in as me. Yep, I'm going to choose Rob. And I'll type in password. And as myself, I will chat with Rob. Hit go, and of course the message comes back up. Nice and quick and so on. So it's a basic WebSocket application. Not all that interesting. If you want to sit there and configure the session timeout, you can. I just couldn't find a suitable value that would justify the dead time on air. So that's that. But you'll see that the HTTP session doesn't ever expire, and that's the key takeaway there. Let's see. Moving on. Another use case, again, because you're using a framework here, and the framework has a user space sort of knowledge of what's happening, and it can get plugged into things like, for example, Spring Security. Another use case that's very easy to support is this idea of user switching. So when you use Spring Session, you have these custom APIs that are available through request attributes with well-known key names. For example, HTTP Session Manager class.getName will give you the key that you need to look up the HTTP Session Manager from the current request. And then from there, you can look up the session repository, which is just a strategy that Spring Session provides for persisting sessions. And then from there, you can say, give me the current session alias. The current session alias is an abstract arbitrary string. It might, for example, be JLong. I might be using my Spring Security principal name as the alias, and I can correlate all my open sessions. So these cases, I have one browser tab, but I want to have two different accounts. For example, I might have my company Gmail or my personal Gmail, and I want to be able to switch back and forth. This is a sort of way to get that same effect, right? And then when you use the session manager and get the session IDs, you get back a map of session IDs, session alias to IDs. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at this use case here. This one's actually a fair bit. It's a little bit more sophisticated, complicated, whatever, in that we've actually got time leaf and we're using layouts and so on. It's an actual web application, just like the WebSocket one. And to keep things as simple as possible, albeit a little bit inefficient, and that's why I'm warning you about this, I created a little component here called link handler that does one job, which is it sets up links that are rendered in every page view. Again, I cannot stress this enough. This is much better done as a filter, but I wanted to be very clear what's happening when you look at the code. So put this in a filter and then don't do what I'm doing here, but the same effect happens. Or use a controller advice, that might work as well. All that's happening is we're on each request, we get the current username, put that in the model, which will be available for the page to dereference in the template. And then we go through all the current sessions for a given alias and the session IDs, and then we look up the current session for a given alias, and then we get the security context, and basically we build up a list of accounts. The result is we build up a list of accounts that end up having account POJOs. These account POJOs are created right here, and it has the username, the logout URL, and the switch account URL. So these are accounts that you can see on the client, and of course the account is just a little POJO down here, nothing special about that. And we have three endpoints: logout, which of course invalidates the HTTP session and logs the user out, and of course we set up the links. We have another one called index, which just show the landing page, and another one called link, just to demonstrate that you can navigate around and session identity is retained despite the navigation. So all of this is fairly straightforward. What's important is that we're able to write a custom Google Accounts sort of use case here, a sort of implementation here. It's not particularly interesting code, but we're able to get it working. So I'm not sure if that's the old one or the new one. Let's just close it and try again. Here we go. Okay. Go to my local host. Oops, it gave me a class not found exception. That's because it's trying to look at data inside of Redis, which of course doesn't have the right kind of types in there, right? This is a different class, different JVM. So I'm going to flush it. I'll go back here now, hit refresh, and you can see that everything's fine. Remember, by default, you're going to get a global key space with Redis, so much better to spin up different Redises for different applications. So anyway, logging in now, Rob. Okay, no thank you. And I'm logged in here, and I can see I've got one account logged in. I'm going to click on Add Account, and here I'll log in as Luke. No thank you. And now I've got two accounts, so I can switch users, right? I can go to any of these links, and you can see on the links here, even though I'm going to /home, the home link says /__s = 1. So that's the session ID being automatically added to the rewritten links on the page. Same thing for the link page. So if I go to home, if I go to link itself, I can see that the information is the same on both pages. But then I can switch accounts, and I retain that information across requests as well, right? So very easy to set up, very easy to get working, and of course I can log out, and now I can add an account and so on. Rob. Okay, and of course, just to drive home the point, all that created the right amount of sessions and so on in our Redis. So I haven't mentioned a few other things that we could do because these are fairly obvious. I just wanted to remind people about them. One is the various scopes in Spring MVC. So, for example, the session scope, when put on a POJO, and again, that POJO should be serializable. Don't forget that. That annotation, when put on a bean of that's serializable, tells Spring to manage the life cycle of that bean along the lifeline along the life cycle of the HTTP session. So here, when the session is created, it's going to see the bean, and then it's going to create it and then store it in the session and then access it on subsequent requests so long as there is a valid session. Very convenient feature. You probably already knew about that. There's also the Flash scope, which is introduced in Spring 3.1, I want to say. Basically, this is a way of building apps that survive, building data that survives redirects. So the use case used to be, and you might still be doing this, but again, it's not so common with client-side applications and single-page apps and so on. The use case used to be that if I submitted a form, the form would do some processing and then invariably dump the user back onto a page that confirms what just happened, or whatever, some sort of landing page saying yes, great, or your information is in the database. The only problem was that if you used a servlet forward, it would render a page immediately, and you could access the same state that was available in the post that was sent into the server. However, the implication was that if you if you went to the browser and hit enter again to the URL bar and hit enter again, you'd retransmit the form data. Instead, in order to avoid that, you can use what is called the redirect after post pattern. So the idea is I send a post into the service, the post does some processing, and then it does a redirect. This is different from a forward. There's a redirect, another HTTP call to another page, and then that is where the user gets dumped. To the browser, the effect is almost indistinguishable, but in terms of your application, if you try and refresh the page that you're dumped out on after a redirect, it'll just re-trigger the rendering of that page you're dumped on. It won't trigger the rehandling of the form upload, form data post. And this is great in most applications, except where you want to have state that is derived from the processing in the post. If I want to show a confirmation message saying that your order for whatever, order 5, which is something that lives in the session or something that lives in the post, if that information is no longer there, then I won't be able to render it in the page that gets rendered when you come out of the other end of the redirect. So the Flash scope keeps that information available for one redirect cycle, and then it automatically cleans it up for you afterwards. So it's sort of like a self-cleaning HTTP session value that will work for one redirect and then render. So this is very convenient. One thing that is implied, but what I've shown you here, is that not only can two different applications talk to the same HTTP session state because they're persistent in a backing store, but two logically different applications, not just two different instances of the same one, but two different logically different ones can talk to each other, right? And that's what I mean when we talk about the poor man's single sign-on. You can use that same header, for example, from multiple applications to access the state in that backing service all through this Spring session facade. There are some nice features that are sort of being planned and in the works. And of course, don't hesitate to feedback on github.com/spring-projects/spring-session. One use case is session concurrency control. The idea is pretty simple. It's you log into a web application and you're already logged in some other instance. The canonical use case is you might be logged in at the library. Now, between you and me, I've never met anybody who actually logs into things at the library, but I guess it's a thing. And if it is a thing, then this is the use case that you have. And it's not a very good experience if you log in one node, and then you go to another computer and you can't log in because you're already logged in somewhere else. What most applications do is they say, oh, you're already logged in here, here, and here. Would you like to log out of that? And so you say, yes, please log me out. So that's one of those use cases that it wouldn't, as you can imagine, it wouldn't be very hard to stand that up on top of the primitives that we've already got in place, right? Because again, it's not hard to correlate sessions to user aliases. And then another use case might be to support the claim check pattern. The idea that I have a header, a message header, not a HTTP header, that lives inside of the flow of my batch process or my Spring integration flow. and then that I can use to redeem or claim larger state inside of a session. So again, it's just the equivalent of a cookie, but for messaging flows instead, or for batch processing flows. Another thing that is coming is smarter injectable beans and integration with various frameworks. So in our examples, we saw I had to pluck relevant objects out of the request using well-known keys. This wasn't so bad, but it would be nice to just be able to define the session manager, for example, as a parameter that I can use inside of my Spring MVC controller handlers, just like I can, for example, a Pojo or a URL link builder. Another thing is that for now, serialization remains by default. It uses Java serialization, but there's no reason, since we now control that layer, we couldn't plug in something like for example, JSON or Avro or something more efficient. And of course, by implication, in some cases, also cross-platform, right? So this speaks to that other question of, can I use this stuff across multiple languages? Not yet, but in the future, there's no reason that wouldn't be conceptually doable, if it was worth doing. All right, so I think we're at the end of our journey together here today. It has been an amazing pleasure. I really hope you guys check this project out. It's one of those things where it serves all use cases, whether you're running on a large classic legacy application server like a WebSphere or a JBoss, or if you're running on lightweight embedded containers, or if you're running in the cloud or whatever, or anything in between. There's probably something here for you. Rob, I think, did an amazing job. And I'm online. Like I said, I'd love to carry this discussion forward. Don't hesitate to reach out. I'm also, we are always listening at Spring Central. There's my email, and the code for this is online at github.com/JoshLong/Beautiful Sessions. And of course, be sure to add @Rob_Winch to your Twitter list, because he's one of those guys he doesn't say much, but when he does, it's awesome.
All right. Well, great, Josh. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.
Yeah, definitely, and huge shout out to Rob Winch. Yeah, for sure.
So
we got a couple questions teed. I know. I don't know.
Nobody's proven it. I've asked his family. They say he's a loving husband and an amazing father, but and they insist he sleeps, but I don't believe it. I've seen the commit logs. It just doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I hear you. Yeah, that's funny. It is just goes kind of give you like a real time work stream for somebody looking at the commit logs, doesn't it? Yeah.
Incredible.
So we got a couple questions teed up.
Cool.
I think some pretty basic ones though. Keith Hoop, HTTP basic. Keith Hoops, a gentleman who I've seen ask many a question on our webinar program.
Hi, Keith.
He asks, hey, I may have to work with older containers or application servers. Does this have to be Servlet 3.0? Does this require that your whatever web container you're working with be Servlet 3.0 compliant?
It's helpful. Remember, Servlet 3.0 was introduced in 2009, but it's not really, strictly speaking, required, because you can just take the initializer and then declaratively in your web.xml stand up the same components, right? I haven't done it yet, so I don't know. I can't articulate the specific things you're going to need to stand up, but that initializer is just a programmatic way to do what you could already do with web.xml. So as long as you can do those same things, stand up those same pieces, then it should work just fine. And okay. I hope that helps. And I also hope you're not stuck on containers from 6 years ago or older.
Yeah, sadly, much of the enterprise is, as we know.
Yeah.
Hence why Spring just continues to strive with backward compatibility as much as we can.
Yep.
Yet try to straddle what's coming out with the new hotness. So Keith went on to ask if there was a sample application on GitHub. I think we addressed that, but if you wouldn't mind just backing up to wherever you might have your URL for your GitHub repo, that would be awesome. So Keith can take that down. And let's see. Actually, I think. Okay, good. Someone other than Keith actually did ask a question. That's awesome. Okay, no offense, Keith. We love your questions. Moataz Burnin asks, is using the headers safe against replay attacks? Good question.
Great question. I'm not sure I understand it though.
So I think he's concerned about sticking stuff in, like, you know how you're showing the XOF custom headers before, if you're kind of dumping stuff in HTTP headers,
right,
to pass them around, what kind of risk are you exposing yourself to somebody intercepting that, right? And then tracking it and then replaying it and impersonating effectively.
Right. So if you're building an HTML application, Spring Security by default requires also a cross-site request forgery token, and I think that's what you're talking about. You want to be able to you want something that is required on every request that is unique to the previous one, so that way somebody's trying to replay can't, they'll have an old already used up token from the previous request, and it won't work anymore. So that will protect you. In our case, we're just using that example I just showed uses a simple REST call. And in this case, hopefully you're not, it's machine to machine, and hopefully it's secure. Again, you have the same effects when you use a single page app and you're using OAuth though. So you don't have any unique tokens there either. Hopefully that's another reason why OAuth is nicer, is because you can decouple permission from authorization, right? So you can decouple authentication from permission. So if I am making a request, I can prove that I am also who I can say that I am who I say I am, but I also have this idea of scope. In this case, we just have the ability to prove who we are. So basic isn't a great way to do that. And the benefit of having scope is you can limit what a request that is coming in can do. Right? You don't have to give them carte blanche access. But again, Rob would be the perfect guy to ask. There's his Twitter handle. He's and also GitHub. So definitely check out our spring.io/help questions, something like that. Peter.
Questions.
Yeah, questions. So for Stack Overflow, that'll take you to Stack Overflow. Check out that, and if you've got feedback for the code itself, check out github.com/spring-projects/spring-sessions. Rob, of course, is he's the coolest guy ever to sit down and talk to for as long as you can about big web and open web security questions like that. And he's done an amazing job of making Spring Security secure by default for exactly those kinds of attacks. So check it out. I'm sure he'll help.
Yeah, there's some and there's some more stuff brewing actually with Spring Security that may show up in a webinar here. That's kind of exciting in terms of making Spring Security itself more secure. So there's some cool stuff on that's going to be coming that you may see in a future webinar. Let's see. So Jared O asks, when accessing and then mutating an object out of the HTTP session in a controller, they found that they have to do an attribute set of that object and key back into the session in order to persist the changes. Is there a better way to handle that, e.g. observable?
So at a low level, what you just described is true. You'll have to tell the session that you've updated the object that it previously had a reference to. There's no requirement for the session to just pick that up. You can add a framework on top of that, right? So the framework might let you have this illusion that you're modifying an object, and then that will just get persisted back to the session. So an observable is something. I guess an observable is one way to do it, sure. But again, how often are you modifying objects? Another way to do it is just to use the session scope, right? So Spring's session scope will automatically persist the changes back to the session after every refresh, after every cycle. So that should work as well. But if you're using a framework, maybe a Java Server Faces or something like that, it should have it'll know about changes. It'll do dirty detection. I don't recommend JSF. I couldn't more adamantly discourage you from using JSF if I tried. But
I don't think I can remember the last time I heard you recommend JSF, my friend.
Yeah, just to be clear, there are frameworks that will let you pretend that you don't have a session there, and it'll let you just create all this memory, and part of that is that you can pretend there's no requirement to tell the session about what's happening. Don't recommend it though. If you need to do it, then observable is one way to go. The Spring Session Scope is another.
Got it. Okay. Now that I gave a few other people a chance, I'm going to go back to one of Keith Hoop's unanswered questions. I think it was the last one that he had for the moment. Let me just double check. Yeah. So this is a good question, actually. I think this is very on point. So he says, I may not be able or allowed to be, I may not be allowed to use Redis. Don't ask, in parenthesis. Is it possible to configure your example work? Is it possible to configure your example to work with a certain popular relational database instead of Redis?
Yes, obviously, naturally. I hope that's apparent. It is a strategy. So the way that you store information in the backing store is pluggable. You just create an object that implements the contract. I'm not sure. I don't remember the contract off of the top of my head, but where did I have that? I had that here a minute ago. But the long answer is that you're going to have to do it. You're going to have to do some coding, and I know that's not a great answer. We'd be happy to. I'm sure if you asked nicely, there'd be I'm sure Rob would consider it or add it for you. The way it works is that, where's my configuration? Redis HTTP session configuration, expiring session repository filter, blah 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 blah. Sorry, I'm looking for the right object here. Misleading beam. Session repository, Redis connection factory. I think it's just session repository. Okay, yeah. So the session repository interface is the one that you have to implement. So there's two implementations by default, map and Redis. But again, if you provide your own implementation and plug that in, you can certainly write it to a SQL database, anything you want. You have only a few different calls here in the session, right? So session repository has to be able to create a session, save a session, get a session, and delete a session. And then, of course, the session here is just a POJO that, remove attributes, save attributes, get attribute names, etc. So as long as you can teach Spring Session about that particular implementation, and it's easy to plug that in. After all, Spring is nothing if not a dependency management container. Once you do that, this will be able to talk to whatever you want. And it's not all that burdensome a contract, so put a GitHub issue or heck, send a pull request if you to get further along down the way and feel generous.
Awesome, excellent. Let's see. So, I think that's most of it. Brad asks if there's going to be a getting started guide for Spring Session soon, and to that I respond, we are definitely accepting contributions. But I'll ask Rob about that, but I don't know if he has a guide for Spring Session soon, but I certainly hope so. And we do, honestly, we do accept community contributions for guides. There's a process for that. If you're subscribed to the Spring newsletter, and if you aren't, just go to Spring.io and scroll all the way down and plug in your email address. Every month there's a featured guide, and there's a bit in there about how you can contribute guides. I think there's also some blog entries on Spring.io/blog that detail how you can contribute to the Getting Started guide effort. If you are passionate about it, we'd love your help. So Josh, the gentleman Jared that asked about mutating and accessing an object out of the HTTP session in the controller, he just responded to say, hey, session scope's probably what we need. He's doing an AOP thing to persist the state, but session scope sounds good. Thank you very much.
Cool. I hope it helps, and happy to follow up if you get hung up on something.
Sure. And Keith Hoops also responds and says, thanks, that session repository was exactly what I needed.
Wonderful. Isn't that great?
Yeah, great. Love real time. Go. Real-time feedback for the win. Love it.
Oh, yeah, that's good. Open for extension, but closed for modification.
That's right. That's right. Last question, I think, and then we're good, unless another one pops up. Ankur Bakhtra, I might have said that wrong. Bakhta. He asks, can you cluster Redis? Now, I know you're not the Redis guy, but I was wondering if that's something you might know.
Absolutely, yeah. That's one of the use cases. That's why Twitter uses it, because it's meant to be clustered. It clusters well. It's not perfect clustering. There's a new feature called Redis Sentinel, which is it's what Salvatore, the guy who, by the way, you guys know that Redis is a pivotal project? That's another thing that's worth mentioning. Salvatore Sanfilippo, the guy who works on Redis, he's been hard at work in the clustering the bits, but that hasn't stopped people from using the clustering for a long time. So, for example, Redis Sentinel is a way to do clustering with Redis, and I think it was actually developed by Twitter.
So he wants to know. Ankur wants to know if Redis clustering works. And
it works perfectly.
I think the comment on that is that Ankur, it depends. It depends, right? Like any good IT answer. So, if you're doing WAN replication, you might want to look at something like Pivotal's Gemfire product. But if you're not necessarily, if you're doing something less than full blown WAN replication, Redis may be your baby. So I think there's certain use cases that Redis is great at for clustering, but I think it stops short of full on WAN replication.
It doesn't have that, but it does have. Remember, it's a strategy. So if you want to plug something else in, like Couchbase or whatever, that works as well.
Yep. So Ankur, just to polish that off, I think, if you want to be more specific about what kind of clustering or what level you're looking to, let me know. But it's great for Redis clustering is great, but not when you get into that realm of full on WAN clustering and super high speed, like real time stuff. That's something where you want like an in-memory data grid like Gemfire can help you out. But I think falling short of more demanding use cases like that, I think Redis clustering is awesome. So
it works for Twitter. They scale up to billions of messages.
Yeah, exactly. So one more question came in, Josh, and I think we're going to call it a wrap there. I'm not going to try to pronounce his name. Well, actually, I think I can give it a shot. Saravanakumar, there we go, asks, hey, we want to use a different serializer with Redis, but I see that it's hard-coded in Spring Session with the string serializer. Are you planning to make that configurable in the future? Absolutely.
I imagine this question was asked earlier on because, yes, absolutely. We that's one of the features that we're actually working on. If you look back here, there you go. Optimized persistence. So the above and beyond Java serialization and so on will have support for, the obvious usual suspects, JSON and so on, Avro perhaps, something more efficient as well, and it should be pluggable, just like you can plug in the serialization mechanism for example, for AMQP transit. You could also do the same for this. It'll be a strategy.
Ooh.
That's what's coming.
Ooh, I've heard good things about Avro. That sounds
Absolutely.
exciting. Okay, yeah, I haven't used it, but I've heard good stuff about it. All right, one last question just came in. So
yes,
Caleb, you're making the cutoff here. Caleb asks, will it maybe end up supporting Spring repository implementations out of the box? Seeing as how there are several repository implementations already, might make supporting other databases easier. Try to imagine your pinky at the corner of your mouth when you ask this question.
Yeah. So yeah, that's a very good idea. Again, I don't see why not, but again, that's up to Rob. One thing to remember is that something has to keep track of when sessions expire. So an event mechanism, something that you can use for being notified in a sort of asynchronous way. That's important. So not all repositories provide that mechanism. Spring Redis provides that. It provides a listener mechanism. But yeah, why not? I mean, there's no reason that couldn't be done. And as you see the interface, it's actually already fairly obvious how to get most of that working.
Awesome. Okay, so I think we're let's wrap it up. I think that's it for the questions. Thank you so much, everyone. And I think if it isn't already really obvious to you, I think Eberhard Wolf published an article on InfoQ recently about the death of the Java application server. And I mean, this is just one of those really popular design patterns, I think, from the legacy application server era of maintaining session state. And having something like this, I think, goes a long way towards making it easier for you, the developer community, to think about redesigning apps that are 12-factor ready and ready, cloud-native design, and don't try to persist things to an ephemeral virtual machine file system and store session state, on another tier, outside of the application, so that VMs can crash and come back, and it's no big deal. I think this is a really big piece of enablement for those sorts of 12-factor designs, and just want to encourage you all to keep that in mind as you go back to your jobs where you may be on Java 6, or you may not be able to use Redis, right? Or even Servlet 3.0, as one gentleman earlier was pointing out. So something to keep in mind. Please come back and join us. We're going to be talking about some other really cool stuff in March. The amazing Dr. Sire is going to be joining us on Tuesday, March 10th, for a look at there's a very popular 6-part blog series on dzone and on Spring.io on doing single-page apps with Spring Security and AngularJS, also using Spring Cloud as sort of a simple API gateway in between your JavaScript front end and your Spring backend. So if security is an interesting topic to you, I highly recommend that you join back that webinar. We're actually doubling down on that topic. And then at the end of March, on March 24th, Scott Deeg is going to basically do a very similar talk, except using Polymer on the front end instead of AngularJS. So again, very similar, using Spring Security, Polymer.js for the front end, having a RESTful Spring backend, and then using Spring Cloud as that lightweight API gateway.
By the way, if I may, in that blog series, if you go read it, you'll see he actually uses Spring Session in exactly the same capacity as I just demonstrated here as a poor man's single sign-on, and then throws it out, not because it's a bad fit, it's not the best fit for that particular use case, in favor of Spring Security OAuth. So if you want to see the logical progression from what I showed here using the custom header and so on to OAuth, that's a great blog series. Nice.
Oh, and I missed a question from Mitch Gitman. Sorry about that, Mitch. I think it's a yes/no, though, if we can keep it kind of binary and short. Any support for storing state with Hazelcast?
Yeah, so actually there's a demo. Actually, if you go to, again, my samples are a limited subset of all the amazing awesomeness that is Rob Winch's repository. So Spring Session, Hazelcast, Spring Session reference HTML5. Go here and you'll find there it is, a Hazelcast example demonstrated here specifically.
Yep.
And there's the code.
Awesome. Yeah, I think it'd be a huge win if Rob does consider Spring data repo integration, because then you would just get so many. You get basically every NoSQL data store under the sun, right? Support for that. So that sounds interesting. Cool. And then
it's a subset, right?
Right. True. And then last thing is on the Spring Boot front, Julien Dubois is going to be coming to join us on March 17th and debut his front end generator, JHipster, for Spring Boot. So March is AngularJS and Spring, is JavaScript and Spring month, apparently. JHipster focuses on generating a nice high quality Spring Boot application. But uses AngularJS on the front end and tools like Yeoman and Gradle, Grunt, Gulp, Bower to kind of auto-generate and whip out a Spring Boot and AngularJS app for you. So if that's your something that interests you, please join us on March 17th. All these webinars will go up on the Spring.io website in the next day or two here. If you're ever curious about what webinars are upcoming, just simply go to spring.io. Josh, would you be so kind as to do a quick demo for me on that? Go to Spring.io and go to the blog or go to the search and just type in webinar : so the search button is in the upper right. Click that. Just say webinar, and you'll see all the webinar registration pages there. At some point, we'll get a nice calendar going on for you. But in the meantime, that search works really well, so you can see what's coming up. Because replays are always prefixed with webinar replay, and registration pages are always prefixed with webinar. So just trying to keep some regular expressions for you folks out there listening in internet land. So I think with that, let's close it up. If you're looking for bits, just be aware that we don't support HTTP downloads directly from Spring.io. We really try to incent you to use Maven or Gradle because it's just so much better and so much less painful than downloading stuff by HTTP. If you are desperate and you need HTTP downloads because you're on a weird network or on a closed network or something like that, you can get them from our Artifactory, which is located at repo.spring.io. So if you're desperate, you can get them. We just try not to make it too easy for you because it's just really a horrible experience. And if you're downloading our bits HTTP, you're probably very familiar with the pain. The replay will be available within a week or two. We usually get to it much faster than that, but at the outside of 2 weeks. And the replay will have a link to the slides. And then if you want notification on that, just subscribe to the Atom feed at Spring.io blog. Or you can, if for some reason you just want the video and you don't want all the awesome, amazing blog content from our engineers, then you can just subscribe to the YouTube channel at spring.io/video. So I think that's it. Thank you very much for all the time, the question, the attention, the questions and your attention. And Josh, awesome. Really appreciate you being able to do this intro for Rob's just awesome app server killing project. Think it's did I say that out loud? Sorry.
Thanks for having me.
And have a great day, folks. Look forward to seeing you on the next webinar.
Cheers.
Take care.
Thanks.